Thanks, Arusha. Are you ready for me to kick off?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, so hi everyone. Thank you for finding the time to come, and apologies for the technical hitches at the beginning. Thanks to those of you that have still managed to join. So first of all, let me check if you can see my screen. I can't see any of you. So John, can you confirm? Can you see my screen?
Yeah, all good, Lucy.
Yeah,
Thank you.
oh, good. Okay, great. So our aim in this webinar is to give you an overview of two new sets of weights that we've been developing for working with ASHE, Annual Survey of Hours and Earnings. And we've been doing this as part of the Wage Dynamics project, which for those of you, if you don't know already, is a collaboration across the institutions that are listed at the bottom of the slide, led by UE and funded by ADR UK. So we have 45 minutes in total for the webinar today. In the first part, I'm going to talk about some work we've been doing, looking at non-response in ASHE within the cross-section and development of an alternative set of weights as a result in response to that. And in the second part, John is going to talk about attrition in ASHE and a set of longitudinal weights for users that might want to use the ASHE data and analyse that across adjacent years of the data. In the final part of the webinar, perhaps a bit of most interest, we're also going to talk about how you might also get access to the weights that we've been developing. I should say at this point that there are also two papers, one to go with the cross-section work, one to go with the panel attrition work, and both of those are on the Wage Dynamics website, and there are links to those at the end of the presentation. We will talk for about 15 minutes each. There'll be time for questions at the end of each presentation. However, if you have a point of clarification, query, please interrupt us as we go along. I can't see any of you while I'm talking, so if you do have one of those questions, please feel free just to jump in, or hopefully one of either John or Arusha can nudge me if they spot that you have your hand up.
Yeah, I'll keep an eye out for that. So if you raise your hand using the reaction buttons, we'll spot it. Thanks.
Thank you so much, John. That would be great. And so first of all then, cross-sectional non-response in ASHE. So we've started from the assumption that anyone here already has an idea of the Annual Survey of Hours and Earnings, or ASHE, and is probably quite familiar with that already. So I'll only give a very brief introduction. The ASHE, conducted by the Office for National Statistics, is of course a super valuable and critical source of information on the earnings of employees in the UK. It's based on a sample, a 1% sample of employee jobs. Those are taken from the HMRC pay-as-you-earn records, and the survey samples effectively the same individuals from year to year, which helps to form the panel element that John will talk about later in today's webinar. The survey itself, although it's asking about employee jobs, the actual questionnaire goes to employers who complete the survey. So the employer receives the questionnaire directly from ONS and is asked to complete it for a selected employee or employees. The completion of the survey is mandatory, but that doesn't mean that all employers respond, or they might not respond quickly enough for their returns to be incorporated into the eventual data set. Some rough approximate estimates suggest a response rate that's roughly equivalent to around 60 to 66% based on employee jobs. For anyone that's already used ASHE, you'll know that there are already a set of cross-sectional weights available with the data for each annual edition of the data set that comes out. And those ensure that when you have the weights on, you're analysing the data, it's representative of the population of employee jobs in the UK based on gender, age, occupation and region. And those weights are constructed with reference to the UK Labour Force Survey population totals. However, what those weights don't do is take account of employer characteristics. And so what we wanted to do within our work was to look at whether employer response to the survey, whether there might be any bias within the certain types of employers that respond or don't. So in this presentation and in the paper that accompanies it, we look first at whether particular types of employers are more or less likely to respond to ASHE. Can tell you that they are. So we then go on to look at how the existing weights may be adjusted to address or reduce bias in employer non-response. And then finally, a touch briefly on implications for some illustrative estimates. I should note that we've constructed the alternative weights for the years 2009 to 2018. We start in 2009, so that we've started after the years where there is a cut to the sample in ASHE that some of you might already be aware of in 2007 and 2008. And at the moment, we go up to 2018 as at the point of constructing the weights. That was the year of data that we had access to for the purposes of doing this task. Are some employers more likely to respond to ASHE? To look at this, we compare the profile of employment in the Business Structure Database, or BSD, with that observed in ASHE. I expect you might also already be familiar with BSD, which is effectively a snapshot of the Interdepartmental Business Register, which is a comprehensive list of UK businesses used by government for statistical purposes. And for us, it's really the best available source of information on the population of employee jobs that also has available information on employer characteristics. And you can match employers that appear in ASHE to BSD using the enterprise reference or ENTREF for those who are familiar with the variables in the data. Then if we look at the profile of employment in ASHE and BSD, we can see that there are some differences. So I'm going to skip to the table on the next slide. So just to take a moment to orient ourselves with this table. So this is looking at employment profiles by enterprise size. This first column is the population as we observe it in the BSD. So 12% of enterprises, this 11.6, effectively the first cell, 12% of employee jobs are in enterprises that employ between 1 and 4 employees. At the other end of the spectrum, around 28% of employee jobs are within enterprises that have 5,000 or more employees. The second column shows us what this looks like in ASHE once the weights are applied. So whereas we have, according to BSD, 28% of employee jobs within enterprises with 5,000 or more employees, in ASHE we can see that there are 33%. So there are more employee jobs within larger enterprises within ASHE than there are within BSD. And conversely, at the other end of the spectrum, you can see only around 4% of employee jobs in ASHE are within those very smallest enterprises compared with 12% in the BSD. The third column simply showing you the difference, and the final one, the squared error, and we'll talk about mean squared errors when we come back to that a little bit later in the presentation. We can also look similarly by legal status. So again, here the table follows the same principle, and you can see that more than 70% of employee jobs were within companies according to BSD, but 65% according to ASHE. So broadly speaking, private sector enterprises are underrepresented in ASHE and with public sector ones slightly overrepresented. If we go back, sorry, excuse me a moment. We go back, see larger employers are overrepresented in ASHE compared with BSD. Public sector employers are overrepresented, and although I won't show you a table here, older employers are also overrepresented. Of course, these are just sort of bivariate associations here. Obviously, some of these characteristics are also related to each other. We find the same thing, though, effectively, if we do look within a regression context. So if we look at whether an employer responds or not, within a regression, we can control for their expected probability of response given the size of the enterprise. So if you're a larger enterprise, it's much more likely that you'll be asked to participate in ASHE just because you have more employees, and include other characteristics in that as well, the same sorts of things I've talked about already: employer size, age, sector, also industry and region. Effectively find the same sort of thing. We've seen that from all of the above that some employer characteristics are associated with response to ASHE in ways that are not accounted for by the existing ASHE weights. What can we do about this? So we then go on to construct an adjustment to the existing ASHE weights, or CAL weight, as anyone that's already familiar with the data will know. And our adjustment aims to take account of these residual employer-related response biases that are left. We do this through something called raking, process that adjusts the existing weights so that the weighted ASHE sample ends up being close to the BSD profile along a specific set of employer characteristics. Fortunately, there's a command for doing this in Stata SVY-CalRake. Further details are in the reference at the bottom of the slide if you're interested to read more about the procedure. When we do this, we focus on 3 key dimensions, and those are the 3 that I've already talked about: employer size, legal status, and firm age. We need to be a bit parsimonious about what we include when we do that, because although you want to reduce bias, you also don't want to unduly introduce lots of imprecision in your estimates. So we did play around with some alternative configurations with this broad aim of minimizing bias, but without at the same time unduly inflating standard errors. And then we can look at the results of what the weight means in terms of then comparing again our population profiles from BSD, ASHE weighted with the standard weight and ASHE weighted with the adjusted weight. So we can see this in the next table. The first two columns are exactly what you've seen before. Again, this is by employer size. The first column is the BSD, exactly the figures you saw before, 12%, for example, in enterprises with 1 to 4 employees. And in our standard ASHE weighted column 2, that's around 4%. The third column is once we apply the new adjusted weights, and then you can see that this ends up 9%, much closer to what we see in the BSD. And then if the MSE, the mean squared error here, you can see this has reduced. This is effectively another measure capturing the difference between our ASHE weighted samples and the BSD. So you can see that with the adjusted weight, the mean squared error has dropped quite a bit from 9.5 to 1.4. And then a similar story. Oh, my slides don't want to move on. That's not helpful.
Yeah, it's just frozen for a moment on the employer size one, Lucy.
It's frozen. It's moving my side now.
You're now on implications.
Yeah, it's gone too far now.
Good.
Sorry, my laptop seems to be a bit temperamental today. So same thing, this table, hopefully it's caught up to the right side on legal status now. You see broadly the same thing, that the mean squared error has dropped a lot between columns 2 and 3, and the profile, once we've applied the adjusted weight, looks much more similar to it does in the BSD. Okay, let me check if there was anything else I would answer those. Okay, so then, yeah, implications. What does this adjusted weight mean when we might want to come to use it in our analysis? So we just look at some very illustrative examples of what these weights might do. We focus on one of the measures of hourly earnings. So one thing that we do see is that when we use the alternative weights, skipping ahead to the next chart, we see that the distribution of hourly pay is slightly compressed. So these figures are for 2018, and the left-hand box plot uses the standard ASHE weight, the right-hand side uses our new adjusted weight. And you can see here the median has dropped slightly. I'll show you that in more detail on the next slide in a moment. And you can see a bit of compression of the distribution there as well. The weights also reduce median and mean hourly earnings, but they don't really affect the trajectory over time, bearing in mind we're looking at 2009 to 2018. So on this chart showing median hourly pay, the blue line is median pay under the original ASHE weights. The yellow line is that under the adjusted weight, with the confidence intervals around those. So you can see that the median has dropped, but the trajectory isn't really unchanged. And you would see the same thing if you looked at the mean as well. And then finally, just really to say that when we also apply those within a really simple regression, looking at log hourly earnings on a basic set of employee and employer characteristics, what you find is that the broad associations between earnings and those characteristics remain the same under both sets of weights. We did find some statistically significant differences in the coefficients associated with employer size, also for some occupational groups. Just to recap briefly, and before I pause on the cross-sectional weights, some delay. So we've seen some employer characteristics are associated with response to ASHE in ways that aren't accounted for by the existing weights. To address this, we construct an adjustment to the weight, which aims to take account or reduce these biases. This does then have some implications for the estimates that we produce from ASHE of earnings, reducing in particular our point estimates of median average hourly pay and some compression of the distribution. I'm going to pause there for any questions we might have, and then I'll hand over to John for the next bit of the presentation. Any questions? Thanks, Nye. John, do you want to go for the panel bit?
Well, yeah, I was just going to add one thing which may be of particular interest to Nye. So in the paper, and Lucy will show you a link to that at the end, we have done a few more, there are a couple more graphs in there which show how things change. And one thing which does change a little bit more than the things we've flagged up here is the trajectory of low pay. So the share of people who are earning less than 2/3 the median wage actually goes down a little bit more under the new weight than it does under the old weight. So there's some departure of those lines, and that's not very easy to untangle why that's happening, because the weights are moving people around the distribution. So we didn't present it here because we felt it was probably a bit too detailed for the average user, but it's something obviously of direct interest to you. So you might want to go and have a look at the paper and just check that out towards the end.
Thank you. I will do. I don't suppose you can remember what your number was?
I don't remember what it is off the top of my head. Lucy might have a look, and then she'll be able to tell you at the end, perhaps, while I'm chatting.
What, the percent low paid?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you have a look while I'm trying to answer the question from Balint? So, Balint, you asked, are the weights recalculated each year? So is the bias you observe in ASHE consistent across the period, or do we adjust for each year? The weights are constructed each year, aren't they, Lucy?
They are, yeah.
So we have the same set of characteristics that we're raking to, but the actual weighting adjustment is year specific. Yeah. And although we stop in 2018, that was simply because that was the years that we had available when we were doing the analysis. There's no reason why you can't repeat this and go up to the present day, you know, as new waves of ASHE become available. So have you got an answer for Nye, Lucy?
Yeah, so in 2018, at least I can do under the existing weights, 17.8 is the percentage low paid. It falls to 15.7% in 2018 under the alternative weights.
Yeah.
That's a big fall.
Yeah. So I said to Lucy, maybe Boris will give her a medal or something.
Yeah.
So anyway, yeah,
Okay,
and what's happening, you see, with these weights is basically the median falls because the weights are boosting the representation of people who work for small private sector employers,
who on average pay less.
Yeah. Now,
So,
on the face of that, you might think that might increase the share of people low paid, but it's also moving people around who are between the lowest paid categories and the median. So it's all about how people move relative to one another. But yeah, it makes a difference to some things. And I think that's a general point on weights, is that actually, when you can't really tell what it's going to do to your estimates until you go have a look. So anyway, any other questions on this part, or shall we move on? Anything you want to say, Lucy, before we move on?
no, I don't think there's anything else from me at this point. So if I stop sharing my screen, John, and you can do from yours, I think, right?
Yeah.
I don't think you can take control of mine.
Okay, can you see that okay now, Lucy?
Yeah, got it.
So I'm just going to have to skip past the things you do. Before I do that, though, I think one thing I would just like to say is, obviously our work is produced using statistical data from ONS, but our project is an ADR funded project, in some of it in collaboration with ONS, but ONS haven't endorsed the weights that we've produced. Yeah, there are academic outputs, so ONS don't bear any responsibility for these weights or the way in which they've been constructed. I think that's important to say. So let me just scroll through Lucy's presentation, and yeah, good. So what I'm going to talk about for 15 minutes or so is panel attrition in ASHE. So Lucy has focused on the cross-sectional representativeness, of ASHE. If you take each individual ASHE annual data set and look at how cross-sectionally representative it is of employee jobs. I'm instead going to look at how representative ASHE is when you use it in a longitudinal sense. So when you're looking at people over multiple years, or what we might call panel attrition. So as Lucy mentioned at the outset, and some of you may know, the ASHE sample is effectively a panel. So the way that a person gets into the ASHE sample is that they are selected on the basis of their last 2 digits in their national insurance number. And that sample selection, the number, the digits that are used doesn't change. So it's the same digits every year. So if you are an employee who happens to have a national insurance number ending in these last 2 digits, and then every year that you're in an employee job, you will be selected into the sample for ASHE, and your employer will be sent a questionnaire and asked to respond. So because you have the opportunity to be resampled every year, then when your employer responds, you obviously end up with multiple observations for multiple years, and these can be linked over time. And researchers have used this panel dimension of ASHE in many different ways, but 2 broad groups of paper. So one sort of research paper or analysis looks at wage progression. So they follow people from one year to the next, looking at how their wages change, whether their wages grow or shrink or stay the same, and then trying to understand the determinants of wage progression. So a good example would be Mike Ellsby's paper on wage adjustments through recession, looking at the extent to which people were seeing nominal wage growth or not. Another type of paper that uses the panel dimension of ASHE focuses more on people's employment status, looking to see whether people get displaced from their jobs or whether they exit employment, and what are the determinants of that kind of behaviour. So a good example here would be Richard Dickens' paper on the impact of the minimum wage on jobs, using ASHE to look and see whether low wage employees are more likely to exit employment than higher wage employees. Now, these papers have an inherent assumption, and what they assume is that those people who are observed in ASHE in 2 consecutive years, let's say year T and year T plus 1, it assumes that those people are representative of people who remain in PAYE employment. In other words, they're assuming that those people who disappear from ASHE between those 2 years are representative of those people who are no longer in an employee job. And those people who remain in ASHE are representative of the people staying in PAYE employment, as I've said. So another way of saying that is that they're assuming that any disappearance from the sample, any attrition between year 1 and year 2 is essentially random or can be ignored, so that these samples of people who you observe over time, or the people who drop out, are representative of the broader population of people staying in or exiting PAYE employment. Now, the potential problem with that is that in a standard longitudinal survey, the survey agency would put a lot of emphasis into trying to keep people in the panel and trying to understand who leaves and trying to address any bias. But ONS don't do that. They're only really focused on the cross-sectional survey. So panel retention is not really something they seem to put a lot of focus on. And of course, that means that there may be some scope here for some bias in the longitudinal sample, or at least that it's not really been investigated and addressed. One thing to note then is that actually only 75% of those people who are observed in ASHE in a particular year do reappear in the survey the following year. So if I show you this table, it gives you a sort of sense of the retention rates. So if I just explain what you have here, in the first column, you've got the individual years of ASHE. So if we start at the top, we're looking at those people who are in the ASHE cross-section in year 2004. And in the first cell, labelled T+1, we're looking at the share of those people who are in the ASHE 2004 cross-section who also appear in the ASHE in 2005. So 77.3% of those people in ASHE 2004 also appearing in ASHE 2005. Essentially, those people have stayed in the sample. If you look forward to ASHE 2006, you'd find 71.6% of the ASHE 2004 sample members, and so on. As you can see, retention falls as you go further into the future, away from the year in question. And the other thing to note is as you go down this first green column, the shading gets a bit lighter, showing you that the retention rates are falling over time. Okay, so on average, around about 75% of people appear in the consecutive year after the one that we might observe them. So the question, of course, is whether those people are representative of the people who stay in PAYE employment. So that's what we're investigating here, whether this panel attrition is ignorable. And we're doing that by comparing the probability that somebody exits the ASHE longitudinal sample and comparing that with the probability that people actually leave employee status. And we estimate that from the 2-year annual population survey. So essentially what we're trying to do here is get a benchmark estimate of what kind of share of people typically move from PAYE employment to non-employment in a year, compare that rate with what we see in ASHE, and also compare the characteristics across those two data sets to see whether the rate of exit from ASHE is anywhere near the rate at which people exit employee status, and whether the kind of people who disappear from ASHE are the kinds of people who tend to exit employee status. And through that, we'll get an idea of whether there's excess attrition in ASHE and whether that attrition might be ignorable or not. So just to give you the headlines, employees are 3 times more likely to exit the ASHE panel year on year than they are to exit employment. So as you've seen, 75% of people are retained in ASHE year to year. So we've got a sample exit rate of 0.25. 25% of people typically leave ASHE year to year. If you look at the annual population survey longitudinal data, that suggests that the rate at which people exit employment is about 0.08. So 8% of people typically move from an employee job to some other form of status over a year period. So that suggests, of course, that in ASHE we've got excess attrition, about 17% excess attrition in ASHE than we would expect to see if this sample exit was purely people moving out of scope of the survey and moving out of PAYE employment. Employer non-response, of course, is at the heart of sample attrition in ASHE because, as Lucy said, the ASHE survey is essentially sent to employers. So if you remain in employment, in PAYE employment, you might disappear from the sample for one of a couple of reasons. One might be that your employer has responded in year T to the survey, but in year T+1, they just haven't got round to it. And we see this happening in the data. You can actually observe this because what you can do in the data set is you can see people reappearing back in the ASHE panel, maybe 1 or 2 years into the future, and they reappear with the same employer and they have the same employment start date as when they left. So actually about a fifth of all of these sample exits from the ASHE panel from year to year can be explained with this kind of behaviour. The sample member reappears in a later year of the panel and they've got the same employer as when they exited the panel, and they say that the employment start date is the same as when they exited the panel. So in other words, there's a continuing job and employment relationship going on there, but for some of the years in that spell, the employer has responded, and for others, they haven't. Maybe they just didn't get round to it, did it too late to be included in the data set. So you see these sporadic non-response from an employer, even though the employment spell is carrying on over multiple years. The other thing you see in ASHE is it looks as though what's also happening is people disappear from the sample when they move to different employers. So imagine you might move from an employer who always responds to ASHE. You might move jobs and your new employer perhaps never responds to ASHE, even when they're asked. And in that case, although you're still in PAYE employment, you would disappear from the sample. And there's some sense from the data that this is happening as well. And where we could see this is we can see that the share of employees who actually observed in the data to switch employers looks a little bit low in ASHE. So if you went to the annual population survey, admittedly it doesn't have brilliant data on employer switches, but around 11% of people in the annual population survey seem to have switched employer between year 1 and year 2, and in ASHE that's only 8%. And that implies that the people who are switching employer seem to be more likely to be dropping out of ASHE than those who are remaining with the same employer. So we've got different kind of patterns of attrition going on. What we do then is compare the correlates of panel attrition between these two data sets, and that suggests that it isn't a random process and may then not be ignorable when we're doing our longitudinal analysis of ASHE. In particular, it looks as though if we compare with the kind of correlates of exiting employment in the APS, if we sort of take those as our benchmark, then in ASHE, people seem to be more likely to exit the ASHE sample if they're male, if they're aged 20 to 44, if they've got a job with low tenure, if they're on low wages or hours, if they're in private sector services, and if they're in London and the South East. So maybe just to notice here, Lucy showed that in cross-section, there seems to be an underrepresentation of people on relatively low wages in private sector services. You get the same kind of underrepresentation here in the panel as well. And this panel attrition is also increasing in the later years of ASHE. So what we've done there is use this comparison of the correlates of exiting the sample in ASHE, comparing that with the correlates of exiting employment in the APS to derive some weights which try to correct for the observable biases. And I'll show you in a moment what happens there is you get a small widening of the distribution of individuals' annual wage changes over time. Now, at the moment, these weights that we've constructed only adjust for attrition bias over a period of 1 year. So you can adjust for attrition between year 1 and year 2, or year T and year T plus 1. If you want to adjust for attrition bias over multiple years, so let's say you want to examine people's wage in year 1 and year 5, then that requires us to have some estimate of the probability of that they've really left employment over a 5-year spell. And we don't have that in the APS. So what we're trying to do now is we're going on to use the HMRC PAYE data, where we can hope to follow people over a longer period of time and use that to create attrition weights for longer periods. So just to say briefly how we account then for this sample attrition, how does it work technically? Well, we use the longitudinal APS to run a probit regression where we predict the probability that a person will leave employee status between year T and year T plus 1. And we do that as a function of characteristics that are measured in the APS and ASHE. So things like gender, age, employer size, employer industry, occupation, and so on. We then run the same probit regression on the ASHE sample to predict the correlates of that someone will exit the ASHE sample between year T and year T plus 1. So there we can see in the APS regression the extent to which men are perhaps more likely to exit employee status than women. And then we can see the same thing in ASHE, the extent to which men are perhaps more likely to exit the sample than women. And we can compare those two probabilities to adjust for any attrition bias. So the attrition weight, W@, is effectively the standard ASHE cross-section weight, cal weight, multiplied by 2 terms. And the first term here, 1 over 1 minus the probability of sample exit, what that term is doing is it's saying anybody who's more likely to leave ASHE between year T and T plus 1 will boost their representativeness in the longitudinal sample. But then the last term accounts for the fact that some of those people will truly have left employment. And so it calibrates the adjustment to account for their estimated probability of really exiting employment. So what we're then doing is the adjustment, the combination of these last 2 terms is really just addressing the sample, what we'd call the true sample attrition, the fact that some people leave when they're still in a job. So what does that do to the longitudinal sample? Well, let me just explain what we've got in the table here. Here I'm looking at the sample of people who were observed in 2 consecutive years. So if you look at the first column of data, I'm showing you the characteristics on average of people who are observed in year T and T+1 once I've applied the ASHE cross-sectional weight. So here, let's say, 50.2% of that 2-year sample are male. And then in the next column, column 2, I'm showing you what that male-female differential looks like once we've applied our longitudinal weights. And you can see, because men are more likely to exit the ASHE sample through sample attrition than women, our longitudinal weight slightly boosts the representation of men in the longitudinal sample, correcting that attrition bias. And you can see as you go down the table how it adjusts the profile of the sample by age. So it boosts the representation of young people in the longitudinal sample when compared with the original ASHE weight, and it boosts some of those with low job tenure, and it boosts those from the private sector. Okay, the differences here aren't very large, so important to note that these attrition weights, they're not pulling around the sample in really enormous ways. They're making small adjustments at the margins. What does it do then to some illustrative analysis? Well, what we show in the figure here is the distribution of annual growth in nominal gross hourly wages for a selection of years 2012 through to 2017, using the 2 different weighting regimes. So the dashed lines are using the original ASHE weight, and then the solid lines are using the new longitudinal weight. And you can see what it does is it slightly widens the distribution. So you get slightly more heterogeneity in the growth of nominal gross hourly wages when you use this attrition weight compared to when you just use the normal weight. Okay, so those are the headlines really from the attrition paper. As Lucy said at the outset, there are 2 methodological papers on these 2 weighting systems. The links will be here on the slide and they're on our website. Lucy said at the outset we'd say a little bit about how you can access these weights. We're expecting them to be available to users next month in July 2022. We're just still figuring out with ONS exactly how they will be made available. There are certain some things to be worked through on the SRS side, the Secure Research Service side, for us to properly figure out the best way to make these weights available. It's not yet entirely clear whether we'll be able to give you a variable or whether we'll need to give you some code that you run on the data set to create the weight. ONS are still figuring out some of the logistics of that, but we do expect them to be available one way or another in July. Okay, so I think that's all I wanted to say about the weights. The Wage Dynamics website address is there. If anyone's got any questions now on those longitudinal weights, I'll be very happy to try and answer them. No.
Thanks very much for that, and that's, I suppose, somewhat reassuring that it doesn't completely change the numbers. I think that is quite reassuring, given that I had no idea how big the impact would be, but that's really great. I was wondering about people moving regions. So I'm pretty sure that APS, well, tell me if I'm wrong, but I think the APS doesn't follow people after they move house. Or the LFS doesn't anyway. So I think those estimates will be biased downwards in terms of the number of people making moves, not necessarily in terms of the wage change that they experience. So is that something that you've thought about at all? And is that the kind of thing that HMRC might help with in the future? Do you know?
I think so on the APS, I mean, obviously the APS as a longitudinal survey has its own attrition, which is, substantial. But the useful thing about the APS is that the ONS have modeled that attrition. Okay, so given that they sort of look to see who falls out of the APS sample over over the longitudinal period, and they've got some a regression model which adjusts for that. One of the things it takes account of is housing tenure, for example, whether you're a renter or an owner and so on, which is related to regional mobility. So although one might say that the APS perhaps isn't the perfect benchmark, it could have its own attrition biases. I think what we'd have to say is at the moment, given that ONS have looked at that and they've tried to address it, it's probably the best what you might call official benchmark that we've got. I know, you could go off and use Understanding Society and so on, but the APS is a bigger sample. It's an ONS product. I think it's a reasonable benchmark. Now, what we would like to do with the HMRC, which will be a better solution ultimately, both in terms of perhaps giving us a more authoritative view of attrition, but also enabling us to perhaps look over longer periods, as I said, is in the HMRC PAYE data, you should be able to find every one of these ASHE issued sample, right? So we're in the process now of matching ASHE to the PAYE data set. Not just matching the ASHE observed sample, but matching the ASHE issued sample. So then you should be able to say, right, here are the people who should have been selected in ASHE each year, and these are the people who we actually see. And then you'll be able to have some assessment of who has who's actually made it into the sample, both in cross-section and in panel as well. Now that's not going to be a quick thing, because the matching is quite an undertaking, and that's still going on. But we're hoping to get that data through reasonably soon, and so that's something we'll be doing through the latter part of this year, is trying to address and understand the attrition both in cross-section and in panel a bit more using the HMRC data. Yeah, and that would of course account for people moving around house. Thanks, Nye.
Thanks.
You're welcome. Any other questions on this? Okay, well, we're almost at 2 o'clock, so let me just put that slide back up there again. If you do have any questions, then you're very welcome to contact Lucy or myself at the end of the seminar or in the future. The web address is there. If you go on to the website, you'll find a copy of these 2 methodological papers. You'll also find some other research outputs relating to the project, relating to the quality assurance of ASHE, and so on. Arusha, a video recording of this webinar will be up on the website. Roughly how long does that take to appear, Arusha? Do you know?
Yes, once editing is done, it will be up within a couple of days for you to be able to view.
So if you've got colleagues who weren't able to attend or who you think might be interested, then you can point them to the website and they'll be able to watch the webinar. And then I think finally, just to say that we have another one of these webinars in a week's time, same time, Tuesday next week on the 21st, starting at 1 o'clock, when I'll be back to tell you a little bit more about some work we've been doing to link ASHE to the 2011 census. So the goal there is to use the census data to bring in more personal characteristics on the individuals. At the moment, ASHE really only has age and gender in terms of the demographics of the individual employees, but we can bring a whole range of other personal characteristics across from the census. So I'll be talking about that matching process and the linking outcomes same time next week. Is there anything else we need to say in finishing, Arusha?
No, I think that's it. Just look out for the posting of the recording on the website by the end of this week.
Super. Okay, well, thanks very much for attending. Apologies for the late start, but yeah, do get in touch if you want to chat any more about these things going forward. Thanks all.
Thanks very much.
Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.